Troutman Pepper has been producing podcasts focused on issues across all of our practice groups that clients will face due to the impacts from COVID-19. Today's podcast is part one of a two-part series focusing on terminating and renegotiating commercial leases. We will discuss some considerations for tenants about commercial leasing trends during COVID-19. I'm Monique Lashbrook, a real estate partner at Troutman Pepper, and joining me today are my fellow partners from the real estate group, Gary Knopf and Hannah Dowd McPhelin. Our discussion today is on commercial leasing during COVID-19. Gary, it's great to be here with you to talk about terminating and renegotiating commercial leases. What sort of renegotiations are you seeing between tenants and landlords, and how successful have these negotiations been?
Hi, Monique. Great to be here. Thanks for putting this together and moderating. So it's been interesting over the past, 9 months now. We've been in this pandemic and seeing kind of things all across the board. You're seeing renegotiations from amendments to delay commencement dates and deferred rent and rent abatement. I'll talk about it first from maybe some of the retail clients' perspective that we represent. And mainly what we're seeing are, first of all, we saw a big pause in the first part of, the spring, right when the height of the pandemic hit, and we were just seeing a lot of pause in deals in general. And then once those deals started picking back up again, we were really seeing, kind of renegotiating time periods and contingency periods. So, created a lot of open-ended inspection periods and permitting periods and a lot of, COVID type delays. So we're really, you can kind of renegotiate and extend timeframes for any type of delays where there might be, the stay-at-home work orders or work stoppages and things of that nature. And then if deals were already signed up, you'd be seeing a lot of deferred or rent abatement requests or rent relief requests. So we were seeing a lot of that, especially in the retail context of space leasing, the smaller retail tenants asking for deferred rent abatement. And what we're seeing is that we're going more towards a percentage rent type of situation where you take out the fixed rent and just pay, a certain percentage of sales over the course of the next few months, could be a year, to kind of get them through this period. From the office perspective and on the landlord side, we're seeing a lot of, not as many requests for rent relief, but some. In some cases, we were seeing tenants use it as an opportunity to try to just get out of leases that they don't want. And you're seeing a lot of this frustration of purpose argument, which was really interesting, where tenants would come in and say, the purpose of my lease of using office space was just completely frustrated based on the pandemic, which I don't think we've seen that play out in courts. It's based on research. It's a little bit suspect right now. But it was an interesting argument that they were making. And I think, we'll kind of see how that plays out in the courts over the next months or even year, depending on how long the process takes. I think that, what I'm seeing to be successful from an actual renegotiation standpoint and to change the terms of the deal, it's really just about reasonableness in my mind. Is the tenant asking for something, using it as an opportunity to take advantage, or are they asking for something because they really need it? I mean, no landlord wants to see the tenant go out of business and create a vacancy. So, I'd like to see most landlords try to work with them as much as possible to the extent they can. Anything different in California that you're seeing?
In California, I'm seeing landlords ask for a waiver of California Civil Code 1542 when entering into a lease amendment. So the landlord's basically asking for tenants to release the landlord from any and all prior claims against the landlord that are known or unknown. And I suspect that the landlords will ask for this more and more as it relates to any liability pertaining to COVID-19. Hannah, what do you think tenants and or landlords should be thinking about or asking for when negotiating a new lease?
Thanks, Monique. Hi to both you and Gary. It's nice to be here with you all. So I think there are a lot of considerations, probably a little bit more on the tenant side than the landlord side, because we're seeing a lot of the requests come from tenants. So I think the first question is, what do they have to give? So to Gary's point, we are seeing some tenants who are just taking advantage of the situation where their business really hasn't been impacted. And in some cases, their business has actually grown because they may be essential or providing some kind of essential product or service. So what does the tenant have to give to the landlord if the tenant's really showing up hat in hand asking for some type of relief, which is usually rent relief or to push back a start date or something like that? We've seen a lot of increased terms. So you may tack on to the end of the tenant's current term a couple of months if they're getting a couple months rent abatement. Sometimes we've seen landlords ask tenants to go ahead and exercise a renewal option early. So adding a much more significant amount of time, like a number of years to a term, in order to get more relief in the near term. And sometimes we see sort of steps of rent, right? So it might just not be just that the tenant gets a couple months free rent, but they might pay 25% of their rent for the next 2 months, then 50%, then 75%. And there may be some type of payback arrangement, or there may not be. So the parties really have a lot of room to get creative. But also to what Gary mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that what the parties work out fits the tenant situation. So the tenants really need to be considering what they can provide upfront to substantiate the condition of their business. So instead of just saying that it has impacted them, they need to be able to provide data to show how it's impacted them, and then also what their outlook is going forward. And I think this is particularly important for landlords because they have to answer to their lenders for the most part. So they are going to need that information because they may need to get approval, relief, something from their lenders. So they have to have that data so that they can approve the deal as well. The other difficulty, I think, is for termination payments. So we've seen lots of requests by tenants to actually just outright terminate their leases. Sometimes this is because of business impacts, but sometimes it's also because we're all, at least the three of us, working remotely, like lots of people. And companies may not need the office footprint that they used to use, so they may be just trying to make good business decisions about what their needs are going to be going forward. The difficulty is that there are a lot of unknowns in the real estate market all over the country right now. So it's sometimes difficult to figure out what a termination payment should be. So we're seeing a lot of back and forth on that. Certainly, if the landlord had provided some type of allowance, build out, they'd incur brokerage fees, you'd expect to see some type of payback for the unamortized portion of those type of transaction costs. And then in addition to that, perhaps a certain number of months rent as sort of, a breakup fee. But again, this is really being negotiated on a case-by-case basis, and we're seeing results that are sort of all over the spectrum. The tenant should also think about any mitigation factors that are available to them. So if the tenant was planning to do a build out or planning to take advantage of an allowance, they should think about whether they really need to do that, because that might be a way to negotiate with the landlord. That'll be less money out of the landlord's pocket that the tenant maybe could recoup or to help lower the rent, which makes it a little bit easier for both parties. Also, if the tenant has contraction options, if they're lucky enough to have an early termination option, if they have anything that like that which is coming up and they want to use it, that's great for them. It may also be a bargaining chip that they can use in terms of giving it up, something down the road that would be a nice option for them. They give it up today, they may be able to get something in the near term that helps their business. On new leases, we're definitely seeing updated force majeure language, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then we'll also talk about tenants wanting some type of rent relief built in to their new leases. So particularly the retail context, if they can't open or they have to shut down, we now want our documents to reflect the situation that we're all in. But I think the current leases don't necessarily do that in a specific way. Sometimes these provisions are specific to pandemics, sometimes they're not. I think on the retail side in particular, one of the things we've been trying to think through is supply chain impacts. So dealing not only with a shutdown at the location, but also a shutdown that affects the supply chain or distribution centers, but maybe doesn't necessarily affect the location, just to make sure that the lease really gives the tenant as much flexibility as possible.
Thank you for that insight, Hannah. Gary, turning back to you, can you give us a few examples of some force majeure clauses to consider including in contracts?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing in terms of added force majeure contracts is really adding in this concept of what it means to be in a pandemic. who gets to make that justification or that, what it is to be in a pandemic, and what happens then. So, who gets to make the call? Is it the WHO, the World Health Organization? Is it based on local jurisdictions that get to make, this is a true pandemic? Is it justified that way? And then what happens when that occurs, right? So if you're in a pandemic, what time periods get delayed? And I'm also seeing, how that force majeure clause affects automatic rent deferral and rent abatement provisions. So what we're seeing now is in some of these retail leases is that you'll see that if there is a pandemic, which kind of goes into a public health concern, kind of triggers the force majeure provision, you get an automatic rent deferral provision that says, you get, if you can't open, or even, what we'd like to see from a tenant's perspective is, any sort of your business not being open, you get rent deferral. A lot of the times that's getting negotiated down to, only partial, if your business is partially open, it's not really fair to get, 100% rent deferral during that, forced closure. But if it's not, if it is completely closed down, then it is fair. So definitely more robust force majeure provisions that include this type of public health concern language that we weren't really seeing before. And, you're also seeing a lot more that's kind of like, especially when you have a tenant that has a lot of leverage, you're seeing a lot more force majeure provisions that kind of have the public health concern language, but also it's more within the tenant's discretion as opposed to something that might be within a landlord's discretion or something to that effect.
Are you seeing any lenders weigh in on these provisions at all? Has that come up yet in terms of giving an abatement? If you have like a major lease?
I haven't seen it yet, but I have been part of those discussions. So I think it kind of goes back to the amount of rent abatement that you're giving and the amount of rent deferral that you're giving. Hannah, have you seen anything in particular?
I've seen lenders weigh in on the sort of short-term abatements, a lot of what we were doing in the spring and early summer. And the ones that got done most quickly were the ones where the landlord had taken the initiative to go to their lender anticipating, a number of requests from tenants and get a certain amount of relief from the lender. And then they could turn around and make their deals with tenants. Again, these were not long-term things, but, where businesses needed a couple months to kind of hold everything off. I did see, as long as the lender was on board, and like I said, I think the landlords were kind of ahead of it and managed better. And those were the least contentious deals that I worked on because sort of everybody was aligned. But I haven't seen in terms of longer term, terminations, things like that.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Hannah, what are you seeing in terms of operating expenses?
So we think there are going to be some changes to operating expenses, but given that most leases have a fairly broad definition, landlords may still be in good shape to pass on what I'll call new COVID costs without too much fanfare. Some of the examples that we would expect to see are, either apps, other technology, personnel needed to monitor access to the buildings. As you all know, for our offices, you now have to take your temperature and log in through an app before you arrive at the building. So things like that either building owners or companies are putting in place. Enhanced cleaning seems like somewhat of an obvious one. So I think cleaning more often, cleaning more surfaces. There's obviously more risk for service providers. So all of those things could lead to more costs. PPE for landlords, property manager, also visitors. In our office, when you walk in on the reception desk, we have masks and hand sanitizer and all kinds of things available. So if somebody's coming to the office and they are not equipped or didn't bring their own mask, we're offering those things. So we would expect to see landlords doing that in a lot of buildings as well. And then updated directional signage was one of the first things that we saw landlords doing. So those are just a few of the examples of things that I think landlords would probably, in a lot of instances, be able to pass through in operating expenses. I haven't seen too many arguments between landlords and tenants so far. It may be a little too early for that. So it may be coming, but the broad nature of an operating expense definition being including but not limited to, those are going to benefit landlords. A lot of times also there's language specifically allowing landlords to include expenses for health and safety concerns for tenants or other occupants of the building. So I think there's some standard lease provisions that actually are going to be helpful to landlords in being able to spend that money and then also pass it through. The tenant pushback would probably be that these new measures are a landlord cost of doing business and shouldn't be passed through. I don't know how successful that's going to be because obviously there are lots of operating expenses that are landlord costs of doing business and running the building that tenants do agree to pay for. I could also see a situation where, as long as we're not talking about really major costs, the tenants are happy that the landlords are actually doing those things and putting those in place, because that could take a bit of the burden off the individual businesses in terms of what they have to put in place to operate in their space. So I think it's still to be determined, but it's something that we'll probably be seeing a lot of over the next couple months.
Yeah, especially just to add, especially as year end and you get to see true ups and audit rights come kick in, and it'd be interesting to see how many tenants audit landlords' expenses and try to really fight the operating expense provisions.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting too to see where operating expenses end up given the various shutdowns, right? I mean, you'd expect to see some savings there, but I think you're right, Gary. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing through the audit in terms of what tenants are actually looking for. Are they auditing more this year? And did landlords really listen?
Thank you both for that insight. Our last question, Gary, what do you think is the most important takeaway for tenants as they think about renegotiating or terminating leases?
I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of just being reasonable, just to draw on what Hannah said, when you're a retail tenant asking for a rent abatement or a rent deferral, and you got to come in with something that shows that you actually need it, and don't just ask for the world. Show that you can't afford rent, show that your business is really suffering because of this, and show what you can do. You can say like, look, I'm doing all right, but I can pay 5 to 10% of gross sales to get me through this. And I think a lot of landlords will be receptive to that. And then if you're asking for a termination of the lease, I think a lot of office landlords are going to want, a pretty good sized chunk of money, not just to say, I've had a situation where a tenant offered a year's worth of rent on an 8-year deal that's left. And, landlords are not going to be receptive to that, especially when you're trying to take advantage of the situation. And so I think it's just, it's about being reasonable. And it's about, offering what's fair. If you want to terminate the lease, you got to come up with some sort of, good calculation of what you can expect, because the market, as we know, is really, I'd like to say it's a good market right now. We all seem to be really busy, but you don't know what it's like from a landlord's perspective going out to lease, 100,000 square feet of new office space. So.
I think just one last point. I would also say, a couple months ago, I heard from a lot of brokers, like, don't even think about subleasing or assigning leases. But just in the last month or so, I've actually seen some pretty good sublease deals get done, even in, major metropolitan areas. So I think it's worth at least checking out that local market. If you're somebody who can't use your lease, you can't, negotiate a reasonable termination agreement, I wouldn't just write it off right away. Or at least look into that a little bit, because I think we might see that come back a bit.
Thank you both. In conclusion, I want to thank Hannah and Gary for joining us today to discuss these important issues. Thank you also to our listeners. For more information on topics we discussed today or other real estate topics related to COVID-19, please visit the Troutman Pepper COVID-19 Resource Center located at covid19.troutman.com. And of course, if we can help you navigate any of the issues discussed during this podcast, please don't hesitate to contact any of your panelists. You can subscribe and listen to other Troutman Pepper podcasts whenever you listen to podcasts, including on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and stay safe.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.